All right, good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to everyone who's on the call with us. And thank you for taking a couple of minutes to start your week with us and have this conversation. I have shared over the last couple of weeks that I've really grown to look forward to this time that we spend together for a couple of reasons. Probably most importantly, it's an opportunity to get to hear and see what's happening at all of your schools and to really kind of in just an hour get a little bit of perspective around what different states, what different areas of our state, even here in California, are experiencing, what's on your minds, and where some of the challenges are that we get to anticipate over the weeks ahead. What I am also really excited about is that we have over 1,000 different schools that are participating in these calls, either live or through the recordings. And what that means to me, or what that does for us, I think, as a whole community, is it makes us more powerful because we are able to benefit from one another's experiences, one another's perspectives, and so many of the ideas that we're going to talk through today in particular come from different parts of our country, different schools, different places, different levels of each school. And so above all else, I want to just start by saying thank you. Thank you for making this network so powerful and so strong. My name is Chris Joffe. I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services, and I'm going to lead us through our conversation today. But again, I want to flag for everybody, especially those of you who are relatively new to our call. We had about maybe 20% or so that signed up just last week for the first time. I want you all to have a little better sense for who some of the other voices on this call are. And so important to share that, of course, our primary focus is K-12 schools. And so naturally, we have a really big chunk of independent schools and charters that are in the K-12 space. But we also have public schools and districts that are on the line with us. We have some colleges that are on the line with us, and then we have some preschools that are on the line with us. And so that, again, kind of gives us these different vantage points that we get to use in our conversation, and also creates a little bit more diversity in the thought and the conversations that we have. And the last piece worth mentioning, just in terms of who's on the call, is we are based in Los Angeles, California. I won't tell anybody what the weather is like today because that just doesn't seem right. But naturally, we have quite a few schools that are in the LA area and in the California area. But indeed, we have about 2/3 of the folks that are registered for today's conversation that are from other states. And the concentrations are generally the DC area, the New York area, Atlanta. We have some in Texas, some in Missouri, and a handful in Florida. And of course, there are many, many other states and cities represented, but those are generally the clusters that we see. And so wanted to share with you a little bit about who's on the line with us as we get started today, because so much of what we're going to talk about from really today forward is going to be dependent on where you are. Oh, let's see. With that, again, as a quick heads up for those of you that are newer, reminder for those of you that are more experienced with us, our weekly cadence is on Thursdays or Fridays. We'll send out an email. On Monday mornings at 9 a.m., we'll hold this call. Throughout the week, you are welcome to follow me on Twitter and just keep an eye on updates that I share that way, as well as to ask questions through Twitter. You can direct message me, you can tweet at me. I'm not using the words right, but you can ask questions there. And of course, you can also ask questions through support@joffeeemergencyservices.com. Our goal in all of this is to be a resource for you and help you anticipate what's coming down the road. And so you're welcome to ask questions. In fact, we encourage you to ask questions as big and macro as they can be, but also as specific as they can be, even if it's just affecting one student, one faculty member, one campus. And so you're welcome to share those questions with us through any medium you wish. And as long as you ask a question by Sunday, we will always answer it by Monday, maybe even on this call, as we'll do today. And if you ask a question by Wednesday, we will answer it for you in the email that goes out on Thursday. So that is really a really high-level overview of how we're aiming to support schools. And I think the last thing I would mention about questions in particular for today's conversation is I know there's David, thank you. There's an NAIS webinar that's starting at 10. So for those of you that are double booked, we are going to cover all of the most sort of highly recognized questions by 10 o'clock Pacific or by, what is that, 1 o'clock Eastern. We will probably stay on. We've stayed on just about every week for at least another few minutes to answer some of those really specific questions. So I want everybody to know that we will absolutely get to every question through this conversation or through email follow-up later on today. As we've done the last couple of weeks, I want to start this week with a deep breath. And I won't walk you through it this time, but I do want to ask everybody to take a nice deep breath. And this week and this weekend in particular, I think we're operating a little bit more quickly than any of us anticipated. We're dealing with more and more of these sort of big news headlines, sometimes scary news headlines, and we're juggling like crazy. And our push to you in today's conversation, in the week ahead, in the months ahead, is to find some way to keep taking these deep breaths, whether you're on your own or with your leadership team or with your entire school community, virtually or in person, but to find some way to sort of ground yourself and to stay grounded in spite of and really through all of the various challenges that are presented to us on any given day. As we go on in our conversation today, please feel free to ask questions. And again, we'll answer as many of those as we can before 10 o'clock, certainly the most critical. And then we will stick around to make sure that we get to all of them in some way, shape, or form. So we'll jump in with what we think is happening this week. A few things that are relatively new, but mostly things that are fairly familiar to many of you. And indeed, today we're going to get into some of the topics around reopening, and so we want to hold space and time for that. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but do want to just remind folks that I think regardless of where you are in the country, it's clear that there are now these two conflicting perspectives around what we should be doing. Some are feeling like we need to do more social distancing. Some are feeling like it's time to return to normal. Not quite our place to make an assessment there as to the way that people are expressing those feelings or those expectations even. But I want to call that out as a potential concern for you. We are going to see parents that are saying this is too much, we should come back to school. And we're also going to see parents that are going to say there's no way we're coming back to school anytime soon. And although we don't necessarily have a great solution there, want to encourage everybody to be aware of it, to be looking out for it. And as you're hearing those challenges expressed by parents, I also want to encourage you to kind of take stock of what folks are saying and what some of the why behind those perspectives is, because it may be informative, and if nothing else, it may be an opportunity to kind of pre-assess what your community's feelings are going to be like when it's time to come back to school. Again, whether that's in a few weeks, in a few months, or frankly, whenever that might be. As we've talked about, I think it's so easy for us to be pushed to try to give answers about where we'll be this summer, where we'll be this fall. And again, today we're going to start to unpack some of that and try to continue to provide some scenarios. We're going to share some of what we've learned from other parts of the world. And so you may begin to think that you have at least a framework. And in fact, I hope that over the course of the next couple of weeks that we can really build together a framework that will work for each of our schools. I also want to be mindful that no matter how great the plan is that we put together, it's probably not going to come to fruition exactly the way that we talk about through these calls and over the course of the next few months. And so adaptability, flexibility, those are really the buzzwords of our future, I think. And so my push to you is, yes, we are ready to start to look beyond that 2 to 3 week forecast, but it's so important that we recognize that we're still guessing. We're still aiming, we're still doing the best that we can to create a plan, but based on some really imperfect data. And so I want to encourage you to own that when you share plans, own that when you share expectations, and be mindful that things are inevitably going to change. There's really no way around that. I think the other source of tension this week is that people are starting to reach a true peak of quarantine fatigue. This weekend in Los Angeles, it was a lovely weekend, and so many folks found their way out to places they may maybe weren't supposed to go to. And so that creates this sort of feeling of freedom, this feeling that at least on an individual level, people have done something different than what we've been doing for the last 6 or 7 weeks. Um, and I think that translates directly into what they expect to be happening in their school environment and their work environment and around them. And so again, it kind of refocuses us on this dichotomy of where we've got some people who are pushing for more and some people who are pushing for less. And again, that is just a fact of the moment that I think we have to recognize. I think we're also starting to see childcare concerns really reach a challenging point. People who are thinking about or starting to be expected to come back to work obviously have questions about how they're going to continue to educate, much less supervise their kids. So that's a factor. And to be totally honest with you, we have not heard great options here. We've heard a lot of different options, and we'll share some of those, including one that might be on its way to great. But generally speaking, that is going to be a concern and a challenge for all of us, I think. And last but not least, I keep coming back to this, and the word resilience seems to be the only word to describe how students are reacting and responding. So often when we look at emergencies and we think about how they impact kids, we worry, and we correctly worry about the changes to their normal. And I think in this particular case, we're seeing students, at least most students, react with a sense of resilience that none of us could have anticipated. And many of the folks that are on this call today, the folks that we're talking with the most, have said their students are more resilient than their faculty, staff, and others in the community. Many have said the same, students are more resilient than their parents. And I think that's really true. And I hope that we can continue to build on that, and continue to help students cope with and manage through this challenge. There are a couple paradigms that I'm going to just reintroduce, and again, in part because of the number of new folks that are on the call with us this week, but I don't want to belabor them. So first is this paradigm that we're borrowing from the California Association of Independent Schools. Now, next, and later. There is this reality that we've got to deal with the now, and that has to be done now. But there's also these other two buckets that we can kind of lump things into, and I would categorize the next as things that need to happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then right now I would say the later is anything that's happening beyond that. And so our hope is that if you can kind of filter things as they're coming toward you into these different buckets, that you can be more equipped to handle them and respond to them as effectively and capably as you possibly can. And again, sort of prioritizing what needs to be in the now, secondarily prioritizing what needs to be in the next, but then pushing out anything that can fall into the later, I think, is probably the most important takeaway from this paradigm, from this slide, and even from this kind of global conversation that we're in. The next paradigm is this idea that we have these two sort of realities that we've existed within. We have our normal education, which for most of us we were doing before the beginning of March, or maybe in the beginning of March even. I keep saying this, but it's sort of incredible to think about how much you all have been able to accomplish in just 7 weeks. And we are, in most of our schools, we're seeing fully blown virtual education take place, and it's incredible because that happened really overnight. But it's gotten to a point where it's good, working toward great. In some cases, it's already great, working toward excellent, just in a matter of weeks. And I think maybe part one of this whole experience is to stop for a second and celebrate the progress that you've already made. Obviously, we have the virtual education that we're living in now. And then what we're really looking to build is this kind of in between, and I hesitate to call it hybrid because, as we'll talk about in a second, there is indeed a hybrid model, but this in between that allows us to lean into, whether it's this year, this summer, or next fall, some kind of new normal that takes the best, hopefully, the best of both worlds. And then the other paradigm worth mentioning is this idea that for some of us, well, I'll back up to say we're all where we are today, and we will all get to a new normal. There's no question about that. Some of us will get there a little bit more easily and without any sort of interference or challenges. Many of us will find that there will be a second challenge, whether it's a second curve or an issue where families have concerns, or an issue where students are hesitant to come back, or staff and faculty are hesitant to come back. I can't say exactly what that sort of interference or what that challenge will look or feel like, but I can say that we should all be anticipating it, and then obviously hoping that we can be on the upper half of this, and that we can work right through it. So I want to there are a couple of really good questions that I want to tackle, and then I'll jump into a little bit of additional perspective, more so than we've talked about in the past. A couple comments about the LA weather. My apologies for those who didn't get to enjoy it. Let's see. Yeah, Janelle, great question. So Janelle's question is, you always say we can only forecast 2 to 3 weeks out, but what about an August start date? And we're going to talk a little bit about that in this conversation today. I would say at first glance, I think an August start date is probably okay, so long as we've built in enough adaptability and flexibility into our plan. And so what I really mean by that is, yeah, I think we can start school anytime, so long as we have both an on-campus and either a hybrid or some form of off-campus model that's developed as well. We're going to talk through that today, so hopefully this will be the beginning of that planning process for you, or for others, this may even already be the middle. I can promise you that this will not be the end of the planning process, but our hope is that at least we can give you some tools to be looking toward. Yeah, Francine, I think that's real. Francine's statement was, as an administrator, I'm dealing with teacher fear and teacher fatigue, and it's seemingly more than students and families. And I think, unfortunately, that is probably fairly consistent with most of the folks on the call. I think students and families are, students especially, probably the most resilient groups. We're going to talk a little bit about teachers and some of that fear and fatigue. And I think for a lot of them, creating and being able to look toward a plan might be valuable. And so hopefully we can start to lean forward into some of that as a bigger community over the course of the next couple of weeks and months. And our hope is that by creating a little bit of clarity, a little bit of kind of making tangible what is going to happen in the future, that we can help them start to move toward this new reality and this new normal. And that might decrease some of the angst and anxiety and challenge that they're experiencing. That's our hope. We're going to kind of listen to you and learn from you as we go forward. And if there are more things that we need to do, or more things that we find that schools are doing, we'll make sure that we share those things with you. But again, I can't underscore enough that I think that's real, and I think it's palpable in all of our communities. Vince, we will absolutely share a copy of the slides. Coming out of today's call, we'll share these slides. We're also going to put up a couple of Google Docs. We'll make sure that you have access to all of those. We've been sending out the email Monday afternoon or Monday evening, so we'll stick to that plan. Everybody who's on today's call will get both a recording, the deck, and these other resources that we're going to share. Mary, that's a great question. I'm going to come back to that toward the end. And Reginald, what a wonderful question to dive into this conversation with. Reginald's question was, with a lack of alignment in state, county, federal, what do we follow? What do we do? And so I'm actually going to use that to kind of dive into today's conversation. I want to present a few different criteria, some big picture scenarios, and then again, I'll circle back into the questions as we've done every maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so. So I want to start with the federal guidelines. I think most of you have seen these, so I will not belabor this, but we've seen the federal government make the statement and create this expectation that first, the three things on the screen need to be true. So the governmental safer at home orders have to be lifted in order for us to come back. There must be a constant or declining count, or have to be in place constant or declining counts of coronavirus cases, and also flu-like infections. It's really important to note that it's not just coronavirus that we're tracking. We're also looking at sort of viruses that look and feel like coronavirus, like the flu. And finally, that hospitals have to be able to treat the volume of patients that they're experiencing or seeing at any given point. So if those three things are true, then the governor has discretion to reopen the state government and sort of infrastructure, economy, schools, businesses, et cetera, at their own discretion. In the federal government's plan, there are 4 phases that I think most of you are very familiar with. And essentially phase 1 is, it says a bunch of things. And I would invite you to go to, it's whitehouse.com/reopening. I'll share that link with you in the follow-up because I'm not sure that's the exact link. But there is a federal government page that has a ton of information on it. We pulled out just the 2 things that are most important to those of us that are on this call. And that is schools and camps, essentially, as long as we're in phase 1, are required to be closed. Once we get to phase 2, then the option comes back to reopen. And so, again, that's going to be, that sort of edict is out there from the federal government. It's up to each governor to either adhere to that or become more conservative than that. So put differently, your governor might say, yes, we could reopen, but we're not going to yet. They can't, as best we can understand, they can't do anything that would be short of that, or that would be less conservative than what the federal government is requiring. That said, that also assumes that we can do the things that are on the screen now. So it assumes that we can do social distancing, and we're going to talk a lot about that because really in a school environment, we think that's probably the hardest thing to do. And so that's where we're going to try to apply most of our support and most of our resources. It assumes that we're doing temperature checks and that we're screening anybody who has a temperature of higher than 100.4 and saying that those folks can't be on campus. It assumes that we have reasonable sanitation, that bathroom accessibility is there. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that. It also assumes that we monitor and we enforce the use of sort of common areas. And so cafeterias, serveries, eateries, libraries, seems like anything that ends in ease. Anywhere where MPRs, anywhere where we might find that a big number of people, especially a diverse group of people, might be coming throughout the day. And so again, we're going to talk a little bit about that. It assumes that we eliminate non-essential travel. I think for most of our schools, that's relatively easier. And then it also assumes these 2 buckets down at the bottom that are probably a little bit tougher, but I think we can be really supportive to you in this. So I don't want to, I guess what I would say is, while these are important, I think these are ultimately going to be spreadsheets, and spreadsheets that we'll produce and you'll get to modify. So the first is we have to be sort of watching our community and looking for people who are symptomatic. And again, that's not necessarily highly difficult. It's more a matter of how do we track it and how do we make sure that we are documenting the fact that we are doing it. And the second is we have to have in place both a policy and procedure for contact tracing should somebody in our community test positive for coronavirus. And again, I think, just as we've shared a temperature screening document with everybody, we will probably put together a similar spreadsheet for each of these areas, or at least a similar document for each of these areas, which you can then copy, edit, and ultimately use to stay compliant with these 2 buckets. So stay tuned for those. Those will not be released in the next 2 weeks. We are not aiming to produce those until probably the first week, maybe last weeks of May or first weeks of June. And then we'll iterate on them. So we'll keep them as online documents so that everybody can stay up to date with the latest, greatest copy that exists. I'm seeing some questions come in around temperature checks, and I want to just flag that is a really important conversation that we'll have, but I want to push it a little bit later in our conversation because we've talked a little bit about it. We're also going to talk a lot more about it as we get closer to this sort of reopening point. So we will answer those questions today, but we're going to push them back just a little bit. The other thing I want to call out is that this is the best guess that we can come up with based on the information that's been released from the federal government and information that's starting to be produced by different states. So the state of Massachusetts, the state of Georgia, I almost said the state of Atlanta, the county of San Diego, actually here in California. There are a few places that have been on the cutting edge of putting resources together and getting more prescriptive around what we need to do in our schools to make them safe and be compliant. We've taken that information and we've essentially pulled from that to create this list. What that also means, though, is that this is not going to impact, or this list will not be the prescriptive approach that every single school that's on this call needs to take. This is our best guess for kind of a nationwide median, but we want to encourage you to continue to check your state government, your county government, and then obviously the federal government's websites that are going to continue to list in an iterative fashion the things that we need to do to keep schools safe. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is our best guess right now, and it's just that, it's a guess. To that end, one of the other ways that we've informed that guess is by looking around the world. So not just around the country, but in other countries as well. We've seen in Denmark that they have been able to open schools once again. Interestingly, and maybe in a way that will mirror what we do here, maybe not, they've chosen to start with kindergarten and primary schools being the first to come back to campus. They are not just expecting social distancing, but they're actually enforcing it. And they're doing a really phenomenal job. And so I know there's a lot of question and a lot of concern, especially from our younger, well, our schools that serve younger students, about their ability to social distance. And Denmark is proving it can be done. It's not to say it's easy, but they're proving it can be done. And again, we'll get into some different scenarios here in a moment. In South Wales, they have begun reopening schools and gone with an interesting and different approach. They've opened school 1 day a week. And the idea, or I suppose they are going to be opening schools 1 day a week. And the idea here is that a smaller group of people are going to be on campus at any given time. They're prioritizing older students who are getting ready to go on in their academic careers. And they're doing that as some of us might choose to try to help them ensure that they're as equipped and prepared for those next steps as possible. And then in Japan and China, kind of across both locations, we're looking at kind of a rolling basis of folks coming back to school. We're looking at, interestingly, rural areas starting to come back to school first. And there's some data that supports that may be valuable in the US as well. Again, not going to get into that because it's not really our domain. But it is to say that we might start to see different states react differently to the reopening, because there might be data to reinforce that or to support that approach. And then there we are also seeing that in sort of higher risk or really dense areas, major metro areas, that they're remaining closed for a little bit longer. I'm just glancing at the questions here for a moment. Okay, there are a couple questions I want to jump into. So let's see, Diane. The question Diane had was, are schools tasked themselves with contact tracing? And the answer is, we're not quite sure yet. Certainly, and I'm seeing a couple of these other questions, certainly the Department of Public Health will be tasked with the sort of ultimate tracing, right? That the highest level of expectation will exist for the Department of Public Health, maybe supported by the CDC in any given location. What we're anticipating is that they are going to create some expectations about how schools report in. And so for some of us, if we think back to the beginning of this response, in those first and second weeks of March, what we were talking about was anytime we had a case within our community, we had to call the Department of Public Health. We'll probably see something very similar to that, where we're calling them, we're notifying them that we had a case. They're then doing the contact tracing, and they're doing the work to figure out where that person was and what the quarantine needs to look like, and who else might be impacted. but that schools would be an important part of that sort of chain of assessment because of the fact that they have more information than the public health department might right away. So again, exactly what that'll look like will probably be different on a state to state, maybe even county to county level. But we expect that that'll be something that is, at least schools will play some form of a role in most places. Ed, thanks for that. I actually am the only one who can see questions, I and our co-presenters, the only ones that can see questions for right now. And Sherry, that is a great question. What symptoms should cause an employee to stay home? Great question. So what we're looking at right now are coronavirus-like symptoms. So specifically, fever is one of the obvious indicators, and the CDC is updating that list. I haven't actually seen online the updated list yet, but there's a list of symptoms that we'll share, we can put in today's conversation out or email out, that is as current as it can possibly be for now. And then what I would encourage folks to do is to reassess that list at least once a month, probably once a week, especially as we lead up to reopening. Some really good questions. So what does reopening look like? This is one idea, and we're going to go through a few today. And again, we've gone through and had some different conversations over the course of the last few weeks. So I want to be really clear that this is one idea. It's not necessarily a recommendation, and it won't work for everybody. And in fact, we're going to present, I think, 3 scenarios today. I hope that one of these feels close, it feels somewhat aligned with what you're thinking, what you might be able to do. But want to recognize that we may not get there today, and we may not get there over the next couple of weeks. And so our hope is not just to give you some plug and play scenarios, although for some of you that might be just what this is. And for others, our hope is that it gets you thinking and spawns some different ideas that might work really well for your own community. Having said that, one approach might be a hybrid approach where we have students come back to campus, and there are a few different ways we could do this. One might be to look at which students are being best served through virtual education and which students are being least served through virtual education. We've heard that that's the groups that are typically least served are STEM classes, our youngest and our oldest grades, our students with special needs or learning differences who potentially have a difficult time learning through virtual education or staying engaged through virtual education. So those are a few ideas of people or students who might not be being served through virtual education as well. Again, your community is going to know this much, much better. Having said that, the idea would be, can we prioritize those things that need to happen on campus or those things that can be better conducted on campus? And can we do that while also providing online education for those other topics, which might be more accessible through virtual education? And so one idea or one sort of solution might look like having a really limited number of students to teachers. So on this slide, we're talking about 1 to 5. I think we probably could see this number go up to 1 to 15. It's each state, each county, potentially each city is going to have a different recommendation for what that top line student count is. Again, we saw that in March when we were first sort of getting accustomed to this. Some people said you couldn't do events up to 50. Some people said you couldn't do events up to 45. The goal is small groups. And so that's what I think we'll see. We might go so far as to say that there need to be masks while students are in the classrooms. And then, of course, we will have some disinfectant policies in place. So before students come in, before students go, the expectation that we would clean the spaces that they're in. So this is one idea. The intent here would be to have some form of on-campus, but also online learning. And I think from a flexibility perspective, this is potentially really valuable because one of the scenarios that, independent of how we choose to return to education, one of the scenarios that we might be coping with is flipping back and forth between online and in-person. And so hybrid potentially gives us a little bit of extra resilience for that, because everybody would be theoretically, continuing to plan for some form of online education. And so that might give us a little bit of extra resilience on the off chance that our county or our city, or maybe even our state or the federal government said we need to go back to a full social distancing expectation or safer at home orders. So again, that's one option. I'm going to keep going, but I'll circle back to this one as we have questions too. Another option, and we've talked about this a little bit more, is extending the schedule. So again, kind of the principal goal here is how can we reduce the total number of kids in any one space at any one time? And so one way to do that might be to extend the schedule, meaning we could extend the year. So instead of going from, say, September to June, we could go from August to July. And for those of you that say, wait a second, that's a year-round school year. Yes, I suppose that is. So we could choose to do that. The other way that we could extend the schedule would be to say we're going to operate from, normally we operate from 8:15 to 3:15, but now we're going to operate from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. In both cases, we could potentially reduce class sizes further so that we have, whether it's 5, 10, 15 students in a space at any given time. Another solution is we could have half the population come in the morning and the other half come in the afternoon. So there are a couple different ways that we could construct when students are on campus and how students are on campus using this kind of scenario. And again, I think it's so critical to come back to the why are we doing this, because there are faculty complications here, there are contract implications here, there are employment implications here. There's so many challenges at stake, and I don't want to undermine or under acknowledge the importance of each of those conversations. But I think what I'd encourage folks to do is, if this feels like it might work, kind of head down that road a little bit and start to have the conversations that you need to with the legal teams, with deans, with a faculty substaff. Try to get a sense for what people might be open to and whether or not this really is an option. I recognize that for many, it won't be, for any number of reasons. For our public organizations, it may simply be a union issue. And then the next possible scenario would be the idea of a rotating schedule. So a couple of us participated in a call with one of our school's leadership teams the other day, and they got into a really meaningful discussion about sort of rotating through, having some students that were, I'm just going to use ABC for now to keep it simple, because this was clearly very complicated very quickly, but potentially having, A students there on Monday, B students there on Tuesday, C students there on Wednesday. Again, you probably wouldn't want to call them that, so maybe it's 1, 2, and 3 because nobody wants to be a C student. But kind of staggering our students on campus and having other students do virtual learning those days. And I think, again, kind of pulling some of the logic from the hybrid model in here, you might choose to have students engage in just those activities on campus that are most grounded to having been done on campus. So put differently, if you need a science lab to teach something, then of course you could choose to do the science experiments or science classes while students are on campus, and choose to do any sort of didactic or other portions while students are off campus. So that's, again, another scenario, another potential solution that may work. I want to pause. Well, why don't I'll keep going a couple more slides, then I'll jump into questions. Regardless of what you choose, and again, the 3 scenarios I just shared are by no means an exhaustive list. They're absolutely not even designed to be that. But hopefully they will either be plug and play for you, that might be great, or will be some ideas that get you brainstorming more effectively or differently about what you might choose to do. And again, we're going to keep adding to that list and trying to make sure that we share different scenarios and share what we hear from our different schools as frequently as we possibly can. Having said that, regardless of what you choose, whether one of those 3 options or something else, there are some general kind of guidelines that we expect will be in place for everyone. One of those will be one entrance and one exit. The goal here is, if we have to do contact tracing, if we find that we have a positive test result and we then have to do contact tracing and isolation, how can we minimize the total number of people that actually need to be isolated? And the answer to that is, if we keep everybody in a single space, all of our students come in a single entrance, they go straight to their classroom, they stay in their classroom, maybe teachers rotate from room to room, maybe students eat in their classrooms. So we're really thinking about how do we contain and really keep everybody traveling in those same packs. Then we only end up having to quarantine or to isolate the group of people who were in close contact with that positive test result. The challenge that we're trying to prevent against is, and work with me here, if two kindergartners come in the same door and they, or say a kindergartner and a third grader come in the same door and they start a conversation and they end up in close contact, meaning they're together for 4 to 10 minutes or somewhere, again, that'll be a different number based on what state or county you're in. But if they're deemed as having been in close contact, now if there's an isolation that takes place in one of those groups, we would actually have to do that isolation in both of those groups because they had close contact to one another through one student, and each of those students then went back to their own classrooms or their own spaces and potentially brought back whatever exposure may have existed. So I didn't explain that as well as I wish I did. But what really we're trying to do here is to create as much containment within the community as is humanly possible, so that in the event that there is a positive test result, that we really can keep the groups as engaged as possible. Beyond that, I think we've talked a lot about hand sanitizer. We're going to see more hand sanitizer in our schools, in our public places altogether than probably we've seen in the past. One solution may be to have people use hand sanitizer on their way into and out of spaces. Hand sanitizer is never as good as washing our hands, but again, as we're trying to be sort of logical, washing our hands a couple times a day is reasonable, but washing our hands every 2 hours or washing our hands every time we move from space to space may not be practical for everyone. And so hand sanitizer might be the second best that we can come up with. And then last but not least on this list, we think probably most schools, if not all schools, will have to at least restrict, if not completely eliminate, access to libraries and cafeterias and spaces where, at least indoors, students would have close proximity to one another beyond those existing groups or packs that we'll talk about. Worth mentioning here, I was in a meeting last week also with a school, and Scott, is it really okay if I say which school? So I heard this brilliant idea of looping teachers with kids, and mind you, I'm not an educator by any shape of the imagination, so I can't really assess whether this does or doesn't work in any given community, but it sounded interesting to me, and I'll tell you a little bit about the logic behind it. There was a conversation that we were fortunate this year that we had already benefited from students building relationships with their teachers. And in creating those relationships and fostering the trust and the boundaries and everything else that was already established as part of the fall and beginning of the spring, well, winter, and beginning of spring this year, teachers were better able to manage and to teach virtually than might be the case next year if we had to start the year virtually. And so an idea came up that we could just loop the teachers with their kids. And so a third grade teacher could become a fourth grade teacher. And for some schools that may not work from a credentialing perspective. For some, it may not work for simply a teacher's capacity perspective. The curriculum is different, of course, from grade to grade. And so somebody who's been a teacher of second grade for 15 years may not be ready and willing to become a teacher of third grade the following year. But it was an interesting idea. It was something that potentially made sense. And again, want to offer it to you all to be thinking about. We talked a little bit about, or sort of in any group that we've been in, we've talked a little bit about picking a couple of events that are most critical to the community. What are the things that would be strongest, most valuable to the community, and how can we plan for one or two of those, as opposed to trying to plan our traditional open house series or fall theater series or fall concert or choir series, whatever those fall events might have been. What if we picked one or two or three and said, we're really going to try to do these with social distancing, with the expectations intact? And again, sort of recognizing that for some communities, events are so incredibly critical. I can't tell you how many virtual auctions and silent auctions and various end of year fundraising events that we've seen take place. So for all sorts of purposes, these may be really important. But what are the things that we might be able to do online versus what are the things that we just must do in person? And then what I would encourage you to do is, as you're planning, kind of pick at least a backup date, if not 2 or 3 backup dates for those critical events, because we may find ourselves having to be back in some form of safer at home orders. We may simply find that we can't do an event on campus. So let's be really mindful of that. This is a piece that came from Scott School as well. Here it's, if we know there's a world in which we might continue to do online education, could we simply choose to build the best online experience possible? And again, that doesn't recognize all of the challenges or all of the experiences that so many on the call have had when it relates, as it relates to this virtual education model. But we do know that at some point in our future, we're going to be doing online education again, whether it's because of a snow day or because of a fire or because of a threat or any other number of circumstances, not the least of which is potentially coronavirus. So if we know we're going to have to do it again, then maybe our focus is there. And then I think the last piece I want to offer that we're hearing come up significantly within the community is that there's some meaningful wear and tear when it comes to switching back and forth from online to in-person education. As we work toward trying to come back to school in the fall, I do want to encourage folks to be equipped and to be sort of constantly thinking about what if we need to switch back to online, or what if we need to start online and then switch back to in-person, and to try to at least identify those friction points that will come up, because they're going to come up. They're present in every community. What are those things? And let's at least put them down on paper and make sure that everybody on the leadership team is aware of what those things are. At most, maybe we can even work to solve for some of them and take some of those points of friction away. But I think it's critical that we get really thoughtful, for lack of a better way to put it, about what those points of challenge are, and that we sort of lean into them and make decisions mindfully of them. Doesn't mean that we can always make decisions that will make them go away, but let's at least be mindful of what those challenges are. I am so ready to jump into questions. I have one last slide for you, but I will share that what we're not hearing yet is really 3 things so far, and I think we'll probably hear some of these, some new things to add to this list in the questions that we'll jump into in just a second. But we're not hearing yet strategies for kids and or faculty and staff with unique needs. And so these are our students, our faculty, and our staff who are over 60 to 70 years old. Again, anytime we start talking about numbers, different states, different counties are going to have a different threshold, but we can say roughly in that 60 to 70 range. Most of us don't have students that are that age, but our colleges may. We're not hearing about sort of strategies for students, staff, faculty with Crohn's disease, with pre-existing conditions, with HIV. There's so many different unique challenges that members of our communities face, and it's really important that at some point we put together a special program for them, or a unique program for them. We're not hearing sort of excellent ideas in that area yet, but we are sort of mindful of that group and mindful of that population, and recognizing that it's going to be weeks as opposed to days before we can start to implement any of these ideas. we hope that we'll have some ideas to share with you with plenty of time before you come back to school. And then probably last but not least, and way overly dramatic and mostly in jest, we listed, we're not hearing about designated survivors yet. And really what we mean by that is in our senior admin teams and our leadership teams, I want to encourage folks, even when we do come back to campus, to keep meeting from or using Zoom. And the logic behind that is our senior admin team has to be intact. We need at least most of that team to be healthy and safe and at school. And so one of the ways that we can really create a headache for ourselves and some challenge for ourselves is by having that group come together and again have a positive test result and have to quarantine that full group. A, they can't be as productive from quarantine as they can be from school or from at least working from home. And B, that's a lot of risk and a lot of challenge that is then experienced among our leadership team, and that will absolutely have effects in other parts of the community. And so I'm actually not saying just pick one person, as maybe they do at the government level, but I wonder if at least in theory, if not in practice, if we could pick our entire leadership team and say, we're going to keep them meeting through Zoom or through conference calls or through other means, maybe outside if they must come together, so that we can reduce the risk of one of them contracting coronavirus. Because again, there's so much challenge that we have to experience should that happen. So with that, I'm going to jump into the questions. There are so many, and so I want to tear through the highest priority ones before 10 o'clock. And then let those of you who need to jump off go, and we'll absolutely get to the rest of them at some point. Yeah, Mark, great question. And I think this is one that a lot of folks are facing. So as we think about extending the schedule, and frankly, even just thinking about how we line all of this up, what I mean by that is, right now, most of our faculty and staff are teaching from home. And so they may have childcare challenges of their own. But how does this shift when and if people start going back to work and the number of kids that are at home starts to get sort of disproportionate to the number of staff, of supervisors, if you will, parents, who are at home that can watch them? So there are real challenges with both of those, both extending the schedule so that you have faculty and staff that are present earlier in the morning, real challenges with trying to sort of work through some of the childcare issues. So I think those are really important, and I have not yet heard great solutions for that. We are looking in other parts of the world to see what people have done, and we're going to keep looking and keep sort of trying to source ideas and solutions. But unfortunately, we have not found any quite yet. So that is one idea that we present that, again, either might create some different ideas for you, or in some communities might work if the staff and faculty population has relatively fewer kids, or has most of their kids at that school, or things like that, where there might be some unique nuances that make it a little bit easier. Margaret, this is a great question. Yeah, this is a really great question. How do buses factor into all of this? The short answer is we don't know yet. Margaret's question specifically was, could you do masks on the bus, and could you do temperature checks at the bus stops? And the answer is yeah, that might be how we across the US choose to sort of manage this. We might say, as we seem to have said for other things, that the buses will go through some sort of a screening process when they arrive on campus. And so maybe the temperature screening actually takes place on campus. Of course, that doesn't necessarily do quite as much as we would want for it to do, but maybe we do masks on the buses and temperature screening on campus. So there are a couple different scenarios that we might see. If anybody's going back this year or this summer with buses, let us know and we'll see if we can troubleshoot some unique ideas with you in the meantime. But I would imagine that early to midsummer we'll have some good ideas for how that will work. To be fair, it may be that we try to prioritize parent drop-off. So there are a lot of different scenarios there that will be at play. And I know for many of us that impacts our CUP and it impacts our neighborhood relations and things like that. So we'll try to be mindful of all of those challenges when it comes to buses. Jessica, this is a great one. Oh, and you know what? I'll answer this, and then I'm going to share a couple of resources with everybody before 10 o'clock. So the question around bathrooms is real. I would offer a couple thoughts. The first is our goal is to try to minimize the number of kids in the bathrooms and to keep the same groups of kids together as much as possible. So one solution might be if your campus has enough facilities or you choose to have a relatively smaller number of students come back to school, you might decide that you're actually sort of designating one bathroom or one set of bathrooms per grade or per population. It might be that we actually go so far as to start to use some of the single stall bathrooms or single person bathrooms. So those are some of the ideas that are starting to circulate so far. Again, I think we'll have a better sense for that, and also for public schools in particular, where there are typically less overall bathrooms available, we'll have some ideas there as well. So I would anticipate those mid to late May and maybe early June. What did I do? I'm gonna push pause on questions for just a second to share two resources with everybody before the 10 o'clock hour. The first is a list of supplies, and I think you probably can still see my screen, so you can probably see what I'm sending you. But the second is a list of ways to celebrate seniors and ways to celebrate students who are sort of at the end of their time with you. And so I want to encourage you to either take an idea or leave an idea in that document. For those that need to jump off, again, totally respect that. Thank you for spending some time with us. A quick reminder for those that missed this at the beginning, you're welcome to ask questions on Twitter. You can always email us at support@joffeeemergencyservices.com. As we head into the summer, it seems things are interestingly ramping up instead of ramping down. So please don't hesitate to reach out as questions come up. We will do our best to answer them for you as quickly as we can. As always, if you ask a question by Sunday, it'll be answered by Monday. And if you ask a question between Monday and Wednesday, it'll be answered by Thursday. Before we let everybody go, I do want to end with this deep breath again and encourage everybody that's on the line with us to take one last deep breath while we're all still together. And with that, I hope those of you that need to jump have a wonderful, safe, and healthy rest of the week. And we will dive back into some of the additional questions for everybody else. So thanks everyone that needs to jump. Again, we'll see you next Monday, and we'll probably send you an email Thursday. All right. Jumping back into questions. Samantha, thanks for that question. Also, hi. Samantha's question was, where can we find hand sanitizer and other PPE? There's no easy answer to this right now. The place that I've heard most schools be most successful is actually through your own cleaning vendor. It seems like whatever the maintenance vendor is, if you have one, they seem to still be able to get access to relatively limited stock. And so would encourage you to take a look there. There are also a couple other providers. Grainger is one. I'm not necessarily endorsing any of these places, but Grainger, which is Grainger. The other one is, I think it's Galls, GALLS.com. And then of course there's Amazon. And what I'm finding is schools keep asking us to publish a list of vendors that have stock. And we've done that a couple times within really small audiences. And then within 5 minutes, that list is outdated. And so unfortunately, it is a matter of keeping somebody assigned to looking. And that's how folks have been most successful, is just waking up each morning and checking for stock and going ahead and ordering it. So I would encourage you to sort of try that approach, again, beyond using your own vendors. Let's see, physical distancing. Yeah, Josh, great question. How to do physical distancing on playgrounds, or is the answer that you don't play? Um, the short answer is, if we can keep the same population of kids together. So again, to kind of use some rough numbers, if we said 15 kiddos are together with one teacher, that group probably could go out and play safely. You'd still try to enforce social distancing. You'd still sort of keep those expectations up. You'd still have to clean playground equipment in the outdoor spaces very frequently, as in between each group of kids. But that might be one way to at least get some outdoor play in. Again, in Denmark, this is one of the areas that they looked at and were really anxious about. We'll see if we can share some more specific information around what they've done to help not just create the expectation, but really enforce it over time. And we'll try to get that to you for our call next week. But I would say, in general, if you're keeping that group contained to just those, say, 5 to 15, whatever your state decides, kids, that may be one solution to lower the risk of any breach of social distancing, if you will, even if it is just for a minute. Yeah, Sindera, first and foremost, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. So your question was, so much of a child's social emotional development is their free play and being able to do everything from playground games to tag. And we have to find mechanisms to create that. So first and foremost, I think, thank you for naming that. And what I would encourage folks to do is be really mindful of the importance of that type of play and that type of activity. And if it feels like bringing kids back to school without that is a disservice to them, then that's where I start to go back to maybe prioritizing the online learning and seeing if there are ways that we can strengthen and improve that online learning experience. Because I have heard from quite a few folks, and I'm seeing some of these questions come in now, if I can't give a hug, if I can't give a high five, if I can't, be quote unquote normal for our students, or do what I would quote unquote normally do for our students, does that create a disservice to the student? And if the answer, I imagine this is probably different on a community by community basis, but if the answer is that, yeah, that would be a disservice, then again, it might be really worthwhile to continue in an online format until we can come back without those restrictions or isolations in place. I do think we're looking at, based on everything that we're seeing, we're looking at a vaccine not being able to be available until at least next year, being next calendar year, 2021. No matter what, we can expect that there will be some delay between the time that that vaccine is available to the time that it's actually in use and sort of widespread access exists. And I don't know whether that's a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but we do know that there will be a little bit of nonsense around getting access to it. So, as we think about this, I think it's worth kind of trying to assess the strengths and benefits, and also the challenges and drawbacks of each of those options. If we come back to school and we can't do those things, is it worth it? Sort of contrasted against, if we don't come back and we continue to do online education, are we missing more than that? And again, I think that's a really different answer for different communities. Ooh, that's awesome, Tricia. So Samantha, let's see, Samantha, are you still with us? Yes, okay. So Samantha, you can access, or at least Trisha accessed pallets of liquid, I think it was hand sanitizer and soap from Cintas. So for those that are not familiar, Cintas is Cintas. So that's one source that you may still be able to get some supplies from. Alice, thank you. Alice just mentioned that kids were playing shadow tag in Denmark, so that might be one creative solution for how to do outdoor play that doesn't involve actually being in such close proximity that we could cause challenges. So that's potentially a great idea. I have to just study the rules of shadow tag a little bit. It's been a while since I've played. Do you cancel indoor PE? Yeah, Reginald. So I'm not sure that any of the governmental resources are going to come out and make a determination on that, only because I think it's such a specific practice, for lack of a better way to put it. But based on what we know and based on what people are saying and what the recommendations are, indoor PE is probably something that we could safely, maybe even should safely cancel. The story behind that is this. So PE, we're going to have lots of activity and potentially sweat and fast, heavy breathing. We know that those are some of the activities that cause the highest transmission of this virus. And we also know that if we're doing those things outside, that there's probably A, greater distance, B, a lower likelihood of transmission anyway. And so I think outdoor PE is probably relatively safe depending on what activities you're doing. Or I think, again, this is not me making my own assessment as much as it is me sort of applying this question to the logic that we have that has been given to us. So I think outdoor play is probably more in line with what those recommendations or guidelines are going to allow, and indoor PE is probably too high of an activity volume to have take place inside based on the information that we have right now. So again, I think we could probably see that shift and change as we get a little closer to reopening. But for right now, I would say that it would be a safe bet to cancel that indoor PE. And let's jump into the temperature. Elise, I love the way that you asked that question. So Elise said, we all have that parent who doses the Tylenol for a child that has a sore throat, a headache, or something, and then they send their kid to school. How do we manage that, essentially? And the answer is, I think most of our work is around education, and most of our perspective is around how can we best educate, how can we support you in best educating. And if we're really, really doing a good job with education and talking to parents about the risks and talking to parents about the importance of compliance here, then I think that's the, I hate to say it this way, but I think that's the best we can do. And the risks that I think we'll call out, and again, we'll probably put together a slide deck or something for you to use, and like everything else, you'll be able to make a copy and make it your own. But I would imagine that deck would include education like, it's really important that we all stay safe. Here are the things that we're doing at school to stay safe. Here are some of the consequences of not staying safe, including we would have to quarantine and isolate your kids. And that may also mean that any of the contact tracing work is also going to include anybody in the home. And so if we kind of share that information, it sounds like we're threatening them, and I would never do that or suggest that we do that. But if we can give education that is fully comprehensive of what the consequences are of people not being compliant, and be really, really clear and informative about that, I think we'll minimize it. To your point, I don't think we're going to eliminate it. I think it's going to happen. And we can stand outside with temperature thermometers and signs and anything else we want to do. There will be a few parents who slip through the cracks, and I unfortunately don't think there's much that we can do to fully eliminate it, but we can absolutely educate around it. And I think we might even be able to build policy around it though that ultimately is going to be a legal question that we'll have to address in the future. Great questions. So kind of carrying forward on the temperature questions, what I think we're going to see, and this is true in Georgia, this is looking like it's going to be true in San Diego, believe this is true in Massachusetts, is that there's an expectation that we're screening for temperatures. And the goal is that you screen, and probably the most practical way to operationalize this goal is that you would screen all students who come onto campus, all faculty and staff that come onto campus, with an infrared thermometer. That might mean a security officer, it might mean your nurse, it might mean a librarian or somebody else whose sort of normal environment has been removed or adjusted. And they would be out theoretically in front of campus somewhere or wherever the drop-off is occurring. And they would do a quick screen to see if students, faculty, staff had a temperature that was above 100.4. Right now, 100.4 is the number that the CDC is using as at risk, for lack of a better term. I would strongly encourage you to talk with your legal counsel about whether you can change that number at all. There's some logic to not allowing folks with a lower temperature to come to campus too. So again, that's going to end up being a school by school decision, but 100.4 is where the CDC has drawn the line. And what you would do is you would screen with an infrared thermometer everybody, and then anybody who tested positive, anybody whose temperature was 100.4 or higher, you'd probably do a secondary screening with, and you might do like an in-ear or one of those thermometers that scans the forehead, a temporal thermometer, to see what their temperature was through that mechanism as well. And if they stayed quote unquote positive, then you might choose to, well, you would choose to not let them to come onto campus, and you'd send them home. Most states, I think, that offer or require temperature screening as part of the sort of welcome to school process will also have a screening form or some screening criteria that you'll have to ask or go through. We have shared one. I'll drop it in today's message as well. Just writing myself a note on that. We've shared one that one of our schools shared with us that asks a few questions. Have you been exposed to anybody with coronavirus or who's tested positive for coronavirus? Have you had a fever? Have you had a cough? Things like that. My guess is that most of the places where we're doing a temperature screen would also have some form of additional screening criteria that takes place, and it would be fairly consistent with that. Again, it'll probably be somewhat different, but the core competency should be fairly similar. So I will share that with you a little bit later today. So that's basically what I think temperature screening would look like for any of our communities who are ultimately required to do it. Obviously, there are a lot of questions there. What about parents who have left? What about kids who come on the bus? What about kids who develop a temperature later in the day? Et cetera, et cetera. So there are tons of other layers that we'll unpack over the course of the next few weeks, but at a very high level, I think that's what we're anticipating for our schools. Melanie, that's a great question. And then Alice, I'll jump back to yours. Melanie and others who are thinking about this. So Melanie said we have a large after school program. And I know there are some after school folks on the call. Let me just see. Yeah, we've got a couple of you. So I think the best after school programs bring together kids from all classrooms and sometimes all age groups even. And so they're kind of all about this idea of bringing people together and doing some form of indoor outdoor activities, et cetera. That's probably one of the biggest changes that will have to be made, is that we probably wouldn't be able to bring together that quantity and that diversity of students. I wouldn't suggest that you make changes on that today for what it's worth. I would wait a little bit to see if we get any more guidance from state, county, federal government on it. And I also would like to see what other countries are doing here. I know that after school is something that's somewhat unique to the US in some ways, but there are plenty of other countries who do something similar. So I'd like to see what those folks are doing. But yeah, using kind of the criteria that we've been charged with, we as a country have been charged with, the after school program at least couldn't operate the way that it is right now, where students would come together from all different classes and all different parts of the community. So again, I would say that's maybe a new area to be brainstorming toward and to start thinking around, though I would suggest not rushing too quickly to make any changes just yet, because it's possible that we'll get some additional insight that would change the rules there. Let's see, Alice. Alice, this is the question I wanted to come back to. So right now, it looks like that screening form that I was mentioning earlier, where we would fill out the temperature and if somebody had been exposed to coronavirus and what have you, it looks like that'll probably be a daily screening for most of our schools, most of our schools who are going to be required to do this. So let me clarify that. Not every state is going to be required to do this, I don't think. A couple of states have come out and said that this is going to be a requirement for the time being. Most states have not come out with any sort of prescriptive protocol yet, but for the states that do determine that this is part of the protocol, I would imagine that this would be daily for the time being, or anytime a student gets to campus. So if a student only comes to campus once a week or X number of times per rotation, it may not need to take place every single day, but I would guess that it will be every time a student enters the campus. Let's see. Lots of hand sanitizer. I hope that sheet with the items to look for is helpful, at least along the lines of what you're going to need. I recognize that it's not very helpful because it doesn't have any vendors or sources on it. So again, what I would encourage you to be thinking about is get out there and try to get those things acquired. And if you start now, recognizing we've probably got at least weeks, maybe months before many of us are back, we should have enough time to get those things acquired. I haven't heard of anybody who is acutely ready to resume school, but because they don't have those items, can't. And if that becomes the case for you, let us know and we'll see if we can find some additional sources or resources at least for you. All right, I think I've gotten to most of the questions. I'm just doing one last look through. Yeah, a couple questions around how long the school day should be when we return. I think that's probably a per school discussion that is based, I think, mostly in academics. And I know I've been a fly on the wall for a lot of conversations around, whether a longer school day is better, a shorter school day is better, starting later or starting earlier. I know there are a lot of different philosophies there on the sort of academic side, and I have no frame of reference for which is most impactful from an academics perspective. I would say from strictly the safety lens, I think we're going to need some buffer time in the morning. So whereas traditionally a bus might have pulled in at 8 o'clock for a school day starting at 8:05 or 8:10, I think we're going to need a little bit longer there. I would estimate about 30 seconds per student for temperature screening. And so you can kind of think about how many access points you would need to have based on the number of students you have, and the number of students that will attend any given day. So I think that's probably one place that will need some adjustment. Obviously, if we decide we want to go with one of the schedules that allows us more flexibility, that will also cause some adjustment. But as far as like a general recommendation around how long the school day should be, I unfortunately don't have any good thoughts to offer beyond those that I just shared. Oh, Casey, I did miss this. Sorry about that. Um, yeah, it's a good point. So for those that are thinking about shifting into a year-round schedule, and frankly for everybody on the call in general, this idea of either year-round, extending the school day so that you're doing, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., even hybrid learning. I mean, each of those draw on a different level of energy, time, effort from faculty and from staff. And so I think we need to be really mindful about how sustainable those things are. And it may not be that we choose not to go forward with a solution based on sustainability, but it may be that we go forward with that solution with some substantial changes. One of the benefits to a lot of year-round schooling, for example, is that there are these other breaks that are added in, and so you get more opportunities for recharging and sort of restoring yourself than even in a 9-month school year you might get. So it might be things like looking at where those breaks can be and what short-term sort of solutions look like. I think, again, as we look at the year ahead of us, the schools that are most successful are probably going to have some form of listening teams or listening people who are simply going to be out there looking to see where everybody is emotionally and physically, and what folks are kind of taking the temperature of folks, not physically but metaphorically, as to what they're up for. And I think many times we're probably going to see um, forms of reprieve that are being offered to different parts of the school community, whether that's through vacation or through perks or through a thank you note from a parent, right? I mean, it could be any number of different things, but offering some form of reprieve as frequently as is appropriate and as frequently as is needed. So I know that's not really a good answer or a direct answer to the question, but I think if we decide to make changes, which most of us don't have a choice but to do, then we also have to think about the impacts and consequences of those changes. And those might include different breaks, different ways of support, different ways of caring. Might include making counseling available, right? I mean, there are a lot of different kind of angles that we could take, and each culture and each community will set its own, to be sure. But I would encourage that everybody figures out what one or two of those things might look like. Let's see, I missed one. Oh, John, yes, I will absolutely reshare those links. So that's the link to the supplies checklist. That is the link to the seniors celebrations. Please keep adding to that, by the way. That is a document that's really for, by you, for you, if you will. So please do add to that, take ideas from it, whatever is appropriate. And I think that takes us to the end of our conversation. So again, I want to just remind folks, you are always welcome to check in and ask individual questions, share questions that we can ask on the webinars, or answer on the webinars, that is. And most of all, please continue to share the resources that you've shared with us so far, and continue to share those with one another as well. We will be sending you an email later on today with the content from today's conversation. There are a couple of slides we didn't quite get to. I think we prioritized well away from those things, but if they're valuable for you in other conversations, want to invite you to be able to use them. We'll also send you an email on Thursday or Friday with what we think is coming for next week, as well as some of the scenarios that we'll dig into for next week. We are going to keep trying to build on those 3 that we shared today, because again, we recognize we have not reached an ideal scenario for every school by any means. Throughout the week, you can follow me on Twitter, send us an email. Both of those are both linked on the slide that you'll get later on, and you can always reply to anything you've gotten from anybody on our team. So thank you again for joining us and for sticking with us. This group of folks that stay over with us seems to be growing, and so thank you for that. and we'll also try to speed things up during our conversations from 9 to 10 as well. So thank you all. I hope you have a healthy and safe week. And if we can be of support, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.